Buonasera a tutte e tutti, bentrovati, bentrovate. Questo è il secondo appuntamento del progetto WeFrame. Come la volta precedente, il secondo appuntamento online, il secondo panel. Come la volta precedente io introdurrò brevemente l'incontro, ma poi passerò la parola subito alla dottoressa Caselli che introdurrà la nostra ospite, la relatrice di oggi, che è la professoressa Silvina Alvarez Medina della Università Autonoma di Madrid, e poi lasceremo spazio al dibattito e grazie ancora alle discussant per aver accettato di partecipare a questo incontro. Come vi abbiamo detto all'inizio, all'avvio del progetto, all'evento di lancio del 17 ottobre, questi panel, questi momenti di approfondimento sono momenti iniziali di scambio e di confronto sui temi dell'eguaglianza di genere, sui contenuti dell'eguaglianza di genere, in vista dei laboratori che poi organizzeremo nella prossima primavera, laboratori che saranno in presenza e che coinvolgeranno le associazioni, i collettivi studenteschi, le istituzioni, quindi saranno laboratori partecipati e compositi nella loro appunto dinamica. E il confronto che cerchiamo di favorire, come sapete, è intersezionale e intergenerazionale. A questo proposito siamo contente di avere giovani ricercatrici che introdurranno i prossimi panel e contiamo sulla loro collaborazione anche per i prossimi laboratori in presenza che vedranno anche il coinvolgimento di studenti e studentesse che sono anche collegate e collegati ai panel, al panel di oggi, al panel che si è tenuto la settimana scorsa e anche agli altri panel si collegheranno nelle settimane successive, nei prossimi incontri. Quindi si tratta appunto di momenti di scambio, questi che viviamo online, ma che sono tutti finalizzati poi, assieme al questionario che il CDS, il nostro partner, sta distribuendo, sono momenti questi di primo confronto appunto dell'avvio di un approfondimento che poi cercheremo di concretizzare il più possibile nel contesto dei laboratori in presenza che si terranno a Ferrara appunto in primavera. Grazie ancora a tutte e tutti della partecipazione e lascio la parola alla dottoressa Caselli.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Camilla Caselli, a PhD student of University of Milan, and I'm very pleased to moderate this second seminar of the WeFrame project. The title is Gender and Care, Transforming Rights and Policies in the European Union. To discuss this topic today, we have with us the Professor Silvina Alvarez Medina. She's an associate professor of philosophy of the law at the Universidad Autonoma de Madrid. Her academic work combines legal and political philosophy with feminist theory, focusing on issues such as personal autonomy, cultural pluralism, human rights, and conflicts of rights in multicultural societies. She has held research and teaching position at several international institutions. These experiences reflect strong engagement with comparative research and European debates on right and the protection of private life. Among her most significant publication is the book La autonomía de las personas, una capacidad relacional. More recently, her research has explored the protection of private and family life concerning sexuality, reproduction, and violence. Her work is characterized by both conceptual rigor and applied concern, offering theoretical tools for the dialogue between moral and philosophy, constitutional law, and human rights. Her presentation today examines the European care strategy, and it attempts to reframe care as a social and constitutional value, not merely a private responsibility or market commodity. Through a relational perspective, she challenges the traditional boundaries between autonomy and dependence, the public and the private, and highlights the transformative potential of feminist constitutionalism. Drawing on thinkers such as Gilligan, Kitai, Federici, and others, Professor Alvarez, Medina invites us to rethink care and common good central to equality, justice, and human rights. Her analysis connects labor policies, social rights, and gender justice, urging a revaluation of care work and those who perform it, often women and migrants. Please join me in welcoming the professor, whose reflection will help us imagine a more caring and inclusive European constitutional order. Thank you.
All right, thank you very much. First of all, thank you very much to the project WeFrame and all the partners, and mainly to Professor Orsetta Giolo for this invitation. I'm very happy to be here. It's a pity we cannot meet all together face to face, but well, it's fine anyway to do it online and to have the time and the space to think about gender issues. Thank you very much, Camilla, for your presentation. It's so nice and complete. I will share now my presentation. Let's see here I think. Okay, so here we are. So gender and care. Okay. Transforming rights and policies in the European Union. This is the title of my presentation. And well, my presentation has mainly two parts. As Camilla said before, I've been working for a while on feminist constitutionalism. And from the perspective of feminist constitutionalism, I have been reflecting also on care, on the value of care, and about how to incorporate care in our legal systems, in our constitutional system. So this is my reflection on the background. And with this reflection on the background, I will introduce now in my presentations in the first part, I will briefly present some of the proposals of the European Union for incorporating care in our policies and in our legal frames. When I say our, I mean European Union countries' policies and legal frames. So roughly, I will try to introduce the European Care Strategy from European Union Care Strategy from 2022 and the aspects I retain important in this European document. And after this introduction, I will try to see how to combine these aspirations of the European Union for European countries, taking into account our liberal constitutional background and our liberal democracies. So I will try to grasp the main aspects of our constitutional systems, and I will try to see how care fits or doesn't fit so well with the demands of care. If I have time, I will explore also some proposal of the common goods or so-called common goods perspective. And I will finish with this approach, which I will try to propose since the beginning. It is the idea of thinking about care as a value. Very often nowadays we talk about policies of care and care rights, and we talk about the right to care, the right to be cared, the right of self-care. And in my view, and what I will try to present here, is that behind all these developments, we should try to think, first of all, about care as a value. So this is more or less my approach. And then I will be very happy to debate and confront these ideas with you all. So when we talk about care, I think we should. Care is a complex notion, and of course we have to think about it, taking into account different important notions and categories from the feminist theory. I think the public-private division is the first one we need to keep in mind. As we know, our liberal political theory and liberal legal systems have this strong distinction between the public and the private. And in this distinction, this has a gender aspect as well. And so care has been for long and traditionally have been placed in the private sphere, in the private, the intimate, and women were the ones in charge of care. The responsibility for care was mainly female responsibility. It was a female, a women's work. So when, after the so-called second wave feminism in the 60s and the 70s last century, women go massively into the public sphere and the market and the labor market. So care starts to be seen as something more than a women's responsibility, because now women have to deal with that, with care. They have to manage care in order to work outside home. They need help for dealing with care work and care responsibilities. And it is from that moment on that institutions, the state, and the society as a whole starts to realize that care and care work and care responsibilities are something to think about. And so here starts all this debate about, do we have a right to be cared? Do we have a right to care? What about self-care? And what about the value of care, or care as a value, as a social value? As we know nowadays, and that's why we are talking about care now and here, because care has an impact in society, in politics, in institutions, in economy, mainly in the labor market. Lots of the worries, and we will see it in a moment, of the European strategy is about the labor market and how to deal with care in the labor market, how to make the things easier for women to incorporate at the labor market, because care and care work at home is a big problem for women when they have to enter into the labor market. So when we talk about care, we talk about understanding, preserving, empathizing. We talk about responsibilities and compromise. And all these aspects of care reveals as well something very important, and is this relational perspective of care. We cannot understand care if we think about the paradigm of isolated individuals. Care is a paradigmatic example of relational way of doing, and this is important as well because in my understanding of the constitutional framework, I will propose also to incorporate this relational perspective. So the thesis that I would like to develop here today is this idea that introducing care in our political and legal systems involves also reviewing our legal frameworks. The challenge is, can we really incorporate care as a value, as a constitutional value, as a right, as a fundamental right, with the constitutional liberal framework we have today? And I think it's hard precisely because of what I said before, this intrinsic relational aspect of care. Our constitutional system, the pillars of our liberal constitutional systems are, for sure, on one hand, individualism, that is thinking about persons as individuals. And when I say individuals, it's mainly a perspective of the autonomous person as a rational and independent person. And this idea of the individual and of the autonomous person is very much linked also to what I mentioned before about the public and the private sphere. This distinction between the public and the private is very much in the genesis, in the very beginning, in the bones of our liberal constitutional systems. And this tough, sharp distinction between the public and the private makes more difficult to think about care as a social value, that is something that shouldn't be in the shadows of the private, the family, the intimate, but something that has to be managed by the society as a whole. And third, the notion of autonomy is another nuclear concept in our liberal constitutional systems. And autonomy, personal autonomy, it's a medular concept. We are very used to it in the law, in legal systems, in political systems. It is a very important moral value as well. But for too long, the concept of autonomy that we have developed in our systems, based on this idea, this conception of the person, the individual, as rational and independent, it has promoted a conception of what I call full autonomy. That is, thinking of the individual as capable of free choice, this capacity to choose. And this capacity has been in some way exacerbated to extreme in which we have put aside another very important aspect, which is vulnerability, and I will refer to it later on. But then, so we have these different aspects in our constitutional system, liberal systems, individualism, the public-private distinction, and the conception of autonomy as full autonomy. And my proposal is that we have to look at the transformation of our constitutional framework if we really think about the incorporation of care as a value and as a fundamental right. So with this idea of this sort of renewal of our legal framework in order to incorporate or introduce care, now I'd like to focus, first of all, I would like to focus in this European care strategy of 2022, which is, I think, a good example, and it summarizes the objectives, the directions or the purposes of the European Union for European countries related to care issues and care work. Mainly after the COVID pandemic, I think the world and Europe as well realized about the importance of care work. It was with the COVID pandemic, we all realized about the importance and how the society as a whole is dependent on care work. And when we say care work, this is a big and a variety of different sorts of work. Of course, health work is an important part of care work, but not only, also education, work in education, and care work in a more domestic sense, if you want. Care work is also that work for nutrition, for tidying up, for having a clean and nice space where to live. And I think that the COVID pandemic made a good service in this sense for the society to realize about the importance and the centrality of care and care issues in our lives. So this document I want to talk about now, it is this European care strategy that it was designed in 2020. I think provides some interesting inputs to think about. The document focuses in two main areas, and these two main areas are, on the one hand, early childhood, and early childhood is mainly from 0 to 3 years old, and of course there we have a very delicate and important children age in which many families and mainly many mothers have lots of work to deal with care issues at the beginning of life. And the other area, important area, is high quality long-term care, where long-term care is care for the elderly people. As we know, in our societies, we have a demographic problem, and long-term care is when we hear that expression, the crisis of care. The crisis of care is mainly thought about the crisis that societies face when they have to care the elderly people in their societies. Very often societies are not prepared. And families, which are also changing, and we have different models, families are not any longer the traditional families. And so care is in a transitional moment as well. So about the first group of care, early childhood education and care, the document of the European Union focuses on different targets, like, for example, well, this I have written down here, remove disincentives to women. The European Union is aware that care problems and care regarding early childhood are an important obstacle for women to incorporate into the labor market. So the document pays special attention to the vulnerable situation of some groups, for example, children at risk of poverty, children with disability, Roma children, refugees, migrants, etc. And the document also focuses on providing care services of quality, for example, regarding sufficient number of hours, proper institutions for dealing with very young children, and with this main objective of enabling parents and mainly enabling mothers, particularly mothers, to engage in paid work. Regarding long-term care, the European Union document, the strategy of 2022, it's curious because it quotes the Charter of Fundamental Rights, which refers precisely to older people and their right to lead a life of dignity and independence and to participate in social and cultural life. And so how to afford these fundamental rights of elderly people, of older people in our societies. And while the focus here is in this transition, which is hard transitions in countries like Spain, for example, we are not yet prepared for this. In Northern Europe, they are much more prepared, I think. But this transition from institutional care to home care and community-based services. And this is interesting as well, because now that we are reflecting on care and what sort of rights are care rights, some theorists wonder if care rights are benefit rights. That is, they are like social rights, social, economic, cultural, environmental rights. Care rights are in this group of rights. They are benefit rights. That is, they are expected to be fulfilled throughout the action of the state and institutions, for example, through health services, educational services, housing services, and so on. But they are not only, in my perspective, care rights. It's a mistake to think they are only benefit rights. They are also liberty rights. And this is particularly, I think, right regarding older people, because more and more people in the last part of their lives, when they become older, their aspiration is not to go into institutional care, residences, and so on, but the aspiration is to have home care and community-based care. And I think this is also a choice that every citizen has to do for himself or herself. And in this sense, care rights are also liberty rights, not only benefit rights to be provided by the state, the community, and so on, but also liberty rights. That the society and our legal systems should think about the proper structure to allow people to choose by themselves what sort of care they would like to receive, for example, during when they are old. So regarding long-term care, the document, the strategy, the European strategy is also worry, of course, about the care sector as part of the labor market, and it realizes about the challenge of upskilling opportunities. As we know, the care sector is a very informal one, and so the challenge here is trying to creating more opportunities, upskilling those opportunities, supporting as well informal carers in the home, family carers, as well as open the market to professional carers as well. And here we have these two different forms of dealing with care issues, which have in some way to live together at the time in our societies. It's interesting as well in this European document, this European strategy, this idea of going towards integrated care. And this is a challenge as well, because policy reforms try to incorporate different ways of dealing, managing with care, including, for example, telecare, telehealth, and robotics. And so if we think about all these aspects, it is really a challenge to preserve a person-centered integrated care when we are talking about, for example, health services, which very often are managed through the telephone, the computer, or different ways of distance managing. So here we have huge challenges in the management of care services. Regarding the strategies in the labor sector, the European Union is also very aware about the working conditions of many of the care workers. And this is why one of the objectives is improving the working conditions and making care jobs more attractive. We know that very often care workers are not paid well. They are in very informal conditions with low wages, and also this is to be improved, and this is to be changed. The wages as well. Another objective is to increase wages, to create better conditions, include increasing wages and having better wages. And of course, the gender issue is also in the document, and the European Union is very aware that the care sector is a sector in which we find very imbalanced distribution of this care work between men and man. And so one of the objectives as well is trying to recruiting more men to reduce precisely segregation and to counteract stereotypes, gender stereotypes. And this is, of course, an important and challenging issue. Besides, between or among the difficult working conditions in the care sector, the document also emphasizes health risks, both physical and psychological, as well as challenging social behaviors like violence and bullying and sexual harassment. And particularly, these are very frequent problems in the case of long-term care workers, which very often has to face this sort of risks within the area, the space of the work. Since they are in the informal sector, as I said before, they have limited access to social protection, and this is something to be changed as well. And this last point, I will refer to it again. Many care workers, we know, are women. Most, we can say, numbers are clear about it, but great majority of care workers are women. And in our European countries, in our European societies, most of them are migrant women. And this, can you hear a very disturbing noise? or you do?
Yes, yes.
Yes. I'm so sorry, but it's someone in some of the flats, they are working, don't know, and so can't help it. I'm very sorry. As I said, the great majority of care workers are women, and many of them are migrant or have a migrant background, which produces the so-called change of care or second, also, Feder Kitai, she talks about secondary dependence, because carers, persons who care, they need someone who cares for them as well. So very often, women at home, mothers, for example, they care their children, but they cannot do it alone, and so they need for carers as well. And so this chains of care reproduce, and the migrant women have a very important role in these chains as well. So now I'd like to focus on some phrases along this document, this European strategy, which I think it's important to notice. Care workers are essential to meet society's care needs, but their work is undervalued, says the document. And I think this is very important. The care work is undervalued in our societies. Policies to formalize informal care can benefit informal carers and their dependents and help recognize and value better caregiving. As we see here, the document is very worried about the issue of how to recognize the value of care, how to make our society and our institutions aware of the value of care in our societies. Here again, investments should take place that take into account the social value of care services and the need to uphold the fundamental rights of persons in need of care. So here again, we see how this idea of care as a social value and of care as a fundamental right is present in the European Union strategy. The strong differences in time devoted to care by women and men can only be tackled by taking a transformative approach that aims to revalue care work. So here again, we have this idea of revaluing care work. I think this different quotations I brought here to you are important for me as an example of this idea of the value of care, the importance of rescuing before talking about care in the labor market, care as a fundamental right, care in our policies and regulations, and so on and so on. For me, it's very important, this idea of revaluing care and care as a social value. And I think that here the care is the point is which care crosses with our constitutional system. And we have to wonder if it is really possible to talk about care as a fundamental right. You know, human rights sometimes are understood as social values or social ends to be implemented. And so we have to wonder and we have to interrogate our legal systems and our constitutional systems in order to see up to what point they are really ready to incorporate the value of care, or instead they are not. And so now I'd like to explore a little bit this constitutional realm, and I would like to explore it in the light of feminist constitutionalism. My suspect is that although women's rights have have entered into our constitutional system, women's rights have entered into the very constitution. Nonetheless, our liberal constitutional systems are still reluctant in some way to incorporate the feminist perspective. And this is what I call a sort of a graft, a combination that hasn't yet been really fulfilled. Well, as we know, as I said before, the constitutions, our liberal constitutions, have incorporated women's rights, have incorporated women's participation in our democracies and legal systems. We have had lots of institutional reforms, and lots of battles have been won. As you know, Ruth Bader Ginsburg, she used to say that this all these rights and all these vindications, they were like case by case, women transformed in some way the constitutional system. And you know, in a way, we can think that this idea of tribe, that constitutions enclose also silences, and those silences of the constitution allowed important reforms regarding women's rights, because liberal constitutions couldn't keep really liberal without incorporating women's rights. And this was, you know, all these transformations that took place from the 70s on, in some countries more recently, but for many, many decades, we were incorporated women's rights, participations, and so on in our systems. So, however, we have incorporated all these women's rights, participation rights, and so on in our liberal and democratic systems, there is a persistence of constitutional and institutional inequalities in our system. And here I quote different authors. For example, Jaramillo, Isabel Cristina Jaramillo, she says, we still have an important material inequality in our systems. You know, however, our constitutions and our legal systems have incorporated so many of the women's vindications. Still, there is a persistent inequality, material inequality between men and women. Francisca Poe, for example, she says, well, if we look at our normative systems, our constitutional systems, sometimes we have this perception of an inflation in normativity. We have so many legal developments, important, very important, but however, or nonetheless, all these legal developments, still women don't feel on a level, on an equal level with men, and there are still so many vindications that didn't have an answer in our legal systems. For example, the case of gender violence. Here in Spain, we had very, very important and crucial legal reforms, not only criminal, reforms of the criminal law, but also the civil law, the judiciary, and still violence against women is persistent. It's persistent in our system, and we keep registering a very, very high number of women victims of gender violence in the couple, in marriage, of course, also sexual violence, and so on. Well, this is only an example, but what I want to highlight with these examples is that still we have something like a constitutional corset that is the pillars of our constitutional system are still reluctant to incorporate deep reforms, because the basis of the system, again, the public-private distinction, the conception of a decontextualized individual, and the notion of personal autonomy as full autonomy, as a full capacity, the one I mentioned before, well, these pillars haven't changed, and they are still the very basis of our democracies. So that's why authors like Rubio Marin, for example, she says now at the moment, we are in a moment of transformation. We have first moment of incorporation of women's rights, a second moment in which women incorporated into the system throughout participation. And now we are in a moment of transforming the system, transforming our constitutional system. But what does it mean? And I think what means transforming our constitutional system means attacking those bases which are in the very structure of our liberal constitutional system. I like this quotation by McKinnon. She says, constitutionalism is too narrow a container to address the problems posed by feminism. So we need to go beyond that corset of liberal politics and institutions. And here my proposal, which I have developed somewhere else, but I will refer here briefly. I think these two aspects are important aspects in order to really transform our constitutional systems from a feminist perspective. One is changing into a relational perspective better than the isolated individualism perspective. And the second one is this idea I mentioned before of introducing care as a value in our constitutional system. So very briefly about the relational perspective. As you probably know, in feminist theory has very, very long developed this idea of relational autonomy. And the notion of relational autonomy precisely opposes to the idea of autonomy as a full capacity. Marta Feynman, for example, she speaks about the myth of autonomy, this idea that the person is a free chooser, this idea of the rational choice, this notion that we can choose among different options and this free election. Well, this is a sort of myth, because what we really have, in fact, is a much more context-dependent capacity. Autonomy is a context-dependent capacity. And not only it's a context-dependent capacity, but the other side of autonomy is vulnerability. And vulnerability as a universal aspect, everybody is vulnerable, but also as a particular aspect, people are more or less vulnerable according to the moment, the situation, the period of his or her life, and so on and so on. And so when we try to see autonomy not only as a full capacity, but as a relational capacity integrated with the notion of vulnerability, so what we have is individuals who are interdependent one to the other. And so from the perspective of the isolated individual, what we can go into is a relational approach. And I think this is this may seem something very just a nonce, just a small difference. But I think, is this idea, Jennifer Nedesky talks about the metaphorical narratives of our Constitution. And I think it's important to change those metaphorical approaches, those metaphorical narratives of our Constitution. And the one of the individual and of the autonomous individual is very powerful. And it's very powerful, and it doesn't reflect reality. But what we have in society are dependent individuals, people who relate one to the other. So I think that changing this perspective into a relational one is one important aspect for thinking about how to transform our constitutional systems. And the second point, and here I would like to say something more about this. I will try not to go too far into it, because I see that we have 5 minutes to 5. Okay, so about the value of care, as all we know, the feminist theory has a long way in care issues and care studies, from Carol Gilligan, so well known, In a Different Voice. In a Different Voice is from 1982, and for sure that book made a difference, and that piece of work, even if very controversial, but it was so important for all the tradition of the ethics of care that came after that and after Gilligan. And what I think is interesting in this feminist work around care is that women have this special ethical approach based on relations and context and interdependence, which also highlights vulnerability. So vulnerability has been traditionally hidden behind that women's work made, in the shadow of the family, of the intimate, of the private. And so that distinction between the public citizen and the private caregiver, I think it's very very illustrative of this distinction. And when, as I said before, in that moment in which women, enter massively into the labor market, care also enter into the market. And I think the entrance of care into the market, or the so-called market of care, also indicates a transition from care as an exclusively family affective, as something to be dealt with exclusively in the family affective sphere, to something that can be managed in the labor market, in a contractual labor sphere. Here, Sandra Fredman, as you know, maybe know her, she's a constitutional scholar in the UK. And she has studied precisely the care market in the UK. And she finds this deficit again in valuing care as an object of the labor contracting. And she identifies this lack of value in the labor contracting of care, as indicating a need also to redefine labor relations. Of course, here we have to define, if we talk about care management, we have different stages, different participants in this sphere of care management. We have those who need care, let's say children, elderly people, people with disabilities, ill people, and so on and so on. Then we have those who are primarily responsible for care, primarily women, very often women in the family, mothers, sisters, daughters, etc. And third, we have pet caregivers. Those caregivers that we can contract in the market. And here we see these alliances which emerge among women caregivers in these different stages. This is what Kitai as secondary dependency, because women who need of other women for building this chain of care. And this chain links vulnerability with dependency, with care and caregivers. Caregivers who are often migrants, and as I mentioned before as well, migrants and racialized, which also stresses how vulnerability is intrinsically connected to these chains of care. And then something else which is important to stress about care, when it goes into the care market, the thing is that, care is not a commodity as any other, but when we contract a caregiver, when we contract someone to care of someone else, there is something unique in care. The fact that we are looking for caregivers who care, caregivers who do their job with empathy and observation, emotional intelligence, and sometimes even not only an emotional link, but sometimes a sentimental link as well. Because here, care has this particularity, if you want, a specificity, that care has to be done with care. When we contract someone to take care of our mother, of our children, or whoever, we are looking also for attentiveness, empathy, observation. And this is something peculiar that it will have to be reflected about and regulated in a special way as well. So how is care managed in our constitutional systems? Well, we can observe different strategies, and some of them were implicit in this European Union strategy that I was analyzing at the beginning of my presentation. We have public services, of course, institutions, the state develops different strategies, services, education services, services for taking care of elderly people, and so on and so on. But beside public services, we have also private employment. We have this mainly middle-class women in our societies have contract care services in order to habilitate themselves to incorporate to the labor market. And another very interesting instrument is the parental leaves. And also the European Union strategy of 2022 mentions this instrument of the parental leaves. Here, for example, Spain very recently has changed the regulation about parental leaves, and at the moment we have a very gender sensible system, which incorporates 19 weeks parental leave for each parent. That is 19 weeks for the woman and 19 weeks for the man. And these leaves are non-transferable, which means that if the father doesn't take the leave is lost, but it cannot be transferred to the women. So parental leaves, and now I would like to refer to parental leaves very briefly, are a very interesting instrument, for sure have been one of the most important ones in our systems to trying to distribute care. They are an instrument for the distribution of care. But of course, this has lots of difficulties because even in systems, for example, like the Spanish one nowadays, which is very gender balanced in their proposal, but even in those cases, even with this legal instrument, it's very difficult to universalize care. The inclusion of men in the system is very difficult because men are still very reluctant to assume and to ask for these parental leaves. So the model has a tension, and this is a tension that we can observe in many other women's vindication, and feminist theory in some way has to deal with this tension. You know, on the one hand, the aspiration is to this distribution of care and a more equal assumption of care responsibilities. But on the other hand, women are still the ones who predominantly take the responsibilities for care. And so the system also has to take this fact into account. And we have to move between these two scenarios, the aspiration to a better distribution and the fact of a very much gender influence or gender I have to rephrase this. So on the one hand, we have this aspiration to a better distribution, but on the other hand, women are still the ones who take care of care in a predominant way. So how to manage with care. So this is the idea. In order to comply with the aspirations I proposed at the beginning of my presentation, in order to comply with the indications of the European strategy of 2022 for care distribution and care work. Well, we have different strategies, in fact. We can manage care through the market and through the labor market and contracts, private contracts of care, through public policies and public services. And then we have other proposals. I have no time here now to develop them. But for example, the theory you probably know of common goods, they have an interesting proposal about throughout what they call the reproductive commons as an alternative model for the management of care as well. The idea is to abandon the logic of distribution, and they propose another way of managing care, mainly throughout the civil society self-management. For example, Silvia Federici or Sandra Esquerra here in Spain are representatives of this position. Well, maybe if you are interested in it, we can discuss about it later on. But now I think I have to close. It's nice that we have silence now, because at the beginning I'm so sorry. The noise was really disturbing. So how then to approach hair management? Here I have explored, as I said, these different strategies: the care market, the parental leaves, and the main idea maybe I would like to stress now at the end of my presentation is this idea that care rights, care politics are not enough if we don't change or we don't look at the structure. And in my view, the problem with care is precisely what also the European Union strategy identifies as the problem. The problem is how to create value around care. As Nedelsky says, to imagine that even optimally funded daycare centers could solve the problems of care is to underestimate the problem. Of course, if we have fantastically funded daycare centers, that will be much better, and that will help a lot to mothers for managing care issues. But that's not all the problem. The problem is how to incorporate care as a value. And so is there, I'm afraid, that we should try to work precisely in the realm of the legal sphere. We should try to incorporate care as a value. Many feminist constitutionalists are talking about the value of care in the Constitution beside values like liberty and equality and dignity. I think the challenge is to work for an incorporation of care as a value, as a constitutional value. Care must be understood as something worthy on a par with freedom or equality. And here I quote Nedelsky again, because rights alone, they don't work. We can incorporate women's rights and women's participation, but we know that if the structure and the basis and the working of the society keeps doing with traditional values, well, nothing really changes. And so, as Nedelsky says, there is a link between rights and respect and economic success and the division of domestic labor. So if we want women to have rights, it's not only to entitle them with rights, but to change the structure. And I think values are on the very basis of those structures. So the challenge, on my view, for achieving all these important purposes of the ones of the European Union strategy the ones that we can identify in our societies, is to open a reflection in politics, in the legal realm, about care and about care as a value. And it's also a challenge for women to invite men to propose and to try to incorporate men into this mechanics or functioning of